Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 193 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be speaking with legendary game designer Warren Spector, who's worked on games such as Ultima VI, Wing Commander, Ultima Underworld, System Shock, Thief, Deus Ex, and Epic Mickey. He got his start in the video game industry working at Origin Systems with Richard Garriott, who was our guest back in episode 105, so definitely check that out if you missed it. Last month, Warren announced that he was leaving his position teaching game design at UT Austin in order to join OtherSide Entertainment, a new company that includes many former employees of the widely admired game developer Looking Glass Studios. Last year, OtherSide ran a successful Kickstarter to fund Underworld Ascendant, a spiritual sequel to Ultima Underworld. The company also recently announced plans to create System Shock 3, and you can learn more about both games over at OtherSideEntertainment.com. And now, here's our interview with Warren Spector. All right, so we're here with Warren Spector. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I saw that Bruce Sterling was your first dungeon master, so tell us about that.
Yeah, a friend of mine invited me to go play Dungeons & Dragons one night in 1978. I'd heard about the game, but I'd never played it. So I said, sure, I'll give it a try, and went over there, and turned out we were going to Bruce Sterling's house. I'd been to parties with him, and he was a friend of mine, but had never played with him. And after that night, ended up playing in his campaign, among many others. But I ended up playing in Bruce's campaign for 10 years. It was pretty incredible, actually. It was an Asian-themed campaign. I was part of the rat gang in the river city of Shang, and we rose from gutter rats to real powers in this universe. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I've heard you say that he was the best DM ever.
He was, at risk of offending all the other dungeon masters I've played with, he was the best DM I've ever played with, yeah. So
what made him such a good DM?
Well, you know, he's a great storyteller, and he created an amazing world. This was long before TSR even thought about doing any sort of Asian-themed adventure or source book. And he created this world, and we had adversaries. There was one guy who bedeviled us for 10 years named Benki Tiger Fang. And we ended up hating that guy with a passion. And as we rose through the ranks, I mean, we ended up with, you know, an army on our side, and Benki Tiger Fang had his army on his side. And, I'll tell you, the way the campaign ended was genius. And this is the kind of thing that Bruce as a storyteller could do. The rat gang rode up on one hillside, and Benki Tiger Fang rode up with his army on the other side on a hill with a valley in the middle. And we charged down into the middle of the valley, and he charged down to the middle of the valley, and that's where Bruce ended it. So to this day, there's no telling who would have won that massive battle. But he was that kind of storyteller. But even more important, he understood that D&D wasn't about him telling his story. It was about the players collaborating with each other and with him to tell their story. He adapted to what we wanted to do all the time, and changed the adventure on the fly based on how we were responding. If we were interested in fighting, he gave us more fighting. If we were interested in talking, he gave us more talking. And so he would modify the adventure to meet our needs on any given night. And yet at the same time, he would always do what was right. You know, there's this tendency, I think, among tabletop role players to say, okay, I must roll the dice here, and I must consult this table to determine the outcome. And he would do what was right for the story. There were times when I know he was ignoring the tables and the die rolls to make sure that the most dramatic things happened. So it was a great collaboration. That's what made him a great dungeon master.
Yeah, and so was he working on his science fiction while you knew him?
Yeah, he had actually, when I first met him, he had written a story for Harlan Ellison's Last Dangerous Visions, which to this day has never come out. So his first professional work, Bruce's first professional work, has never been seen. But his first novel, Involution Ocean, came out when we were, shortly after we started playing. And so, yeah, he was a writer, and then The Artificial Kid came out, and, guys like William Gibson and a bunch of the other cyberpunk writers would come to town. And Austin was a pretty happening place in the cyberpunk science fiction scene at that time in the late 70s, early 80s. So it was a pretty cool time to be here. And yes, he was absolutely writing science fiction at that point.
I mean, do you have any memories from hanging out with him and William Gibson and people like that?
Just that there was this real sense that they certainly felt it, and all of us around certainly felt it, that they were changing the world. They were rebellious and fighting against the orthodoxy of science fiction, thinking, I don't know if they ever put it in these terms, but I certainly thought, hey, they're out there to destroy the Asimovs and Heinleins of the world and show the world of science fiction that there was a new sheriff in town. And I think they pretty much succeeded at that.
I mean, were you ever writing just prose fiction?
Yeah, I actually had a novel published. When was that? Gosh, it must have been 1986 or 87, something like that, called The Hollow Earth Affair. It was kind of an homage to The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I realized how much of it must sound like I was a hack writer, which I was. So yeah, I was writing prose back then in addition to all of the tabletop role-playing stuff I was doing. And, I had the sophomore slump. I started several other novels and have started several other novels, but that was the only one I finished and the only one that got published.
And I mean, you were involved in science fiction fandom as well?
Yeah, I used to go to science fiction conventions all the time, and there was one science fiction convention here in Austin, Texas called ArmadilloCon that in its heyday was what used to be called a literary convention. And that's where folks like Bruce and William Gibson and Ellen Datlow, who's the fiction editor for Omni at the time, and Lou Shiner and Howard Waldrop and Lisa Tuttle. And I mean, there were all these up and coming writers who would be there. But I used to go to WorldCon and NASFIC and all the other conventions. I still sometimes go to cons. I'm debating whether to go to WorldCon this summer. So we'll see. And my wife is a science fiction writer at this point. She writes with George Martin, the guy who created Game of Thrones. And so she goes to all these conventions over the summer, and I still go to some of them with her.
Mm-hmm. You guys met in a comic book store? Yeah,
I've been a comic book geek all my life. And so I walked into my favorite funny book store, Austin Books and Graphics, and one day, and there she was, and the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life. And we talked for a couple of hours that day, and I knew something was going to happen, but I didn't know what it was. And eventually she got a job at Steve Jackson Games where I was already working, and I thought she was following me, but it was total coincidence. And, we ended up dating, and the rest is history.
So did you strike up a conversation about comic books, or how did that happen?
Well, we talked about that first time frankly, we talked about her marriage, which was a little depressing to me, and other just sort of general stuff. I was there with my blind, fat, balding, diabetic dog with a bulging eye. We talked about pets. We talked about all sorts of stuff, but I went in there at least once a week. And so, yeah, of course we talked about comic books a lot. Still do.
Okay. Well, so tell us about the convention where you met Richard Garriott.
I met Richard Garriott at an ArmadilloCon, actually. That was where I first, was on a panel with him. I'd actually met him, earlier because, Steve Jackson Games, where I did my first game work, licensed the rights to Autoduel and Ogre, two Steve Jackson Games products, to Richard when he was starting Origin. So Richard and his folks did computer game adaptations of two Steve Jackson properties. So I got to meet him during the course of that development. But we ended up on a couple of panels together at Armadillocon and at other conventions. And I was just blown away. I mean, I played Ultima 4 and he was working on Ultima 5 when I first met him. And all I could think was, it's not the guys doing the AD&D computer games who are getting it. It's this guy who's getting it, who understands what role-playing is really all about. And, I guess I said enough to impress him that a couple of years later, I got a job working with him, and there again, the rest is history.
Right. Well, when I saw that the first game, that, at least on Wikipedia, that is listed that you worked on is Wing Commander. That's
actually not true. I guess my Wikipedia page needs to be updated. Somebody get on that. No, the first thing I did when I got to Origin was work with Richard on Ultima VI. I was his producer, and we did a bunch of design work together. And he taught me a ton. When I got there, I was coming out of 6 years of working in tabletop role playing, and I was thinking, I'm going to show these computer guys what interactivity is all about. But within a couple of weeks, I realized I knew nothing, and they just schooled me. So I started out with Ultima VI, and then pretty much around the same time, I started working with Chris Roberts on Wing Commander and Paul Neurath on Space Rogue. And I was wearing a lot of hats back then and working very, very hard.
I had a question about Wing Commander because it's rumored online that the Kilrathi were inspired by the Kzinti from Larry Niven's known space books, and there's a Niven sector in the game, but I can't get anyone to confirm that that was directly inspired by it.
I think it's safe to say that Chris was definitely inspired by that. Yeah.
I mean, did you guys talked, I guess, around the office about authors like Larry Niven and things like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there were a lot of science fiction fans and fantasy fans at Origin. So we used to talk about the Dragonlance books and about Jerry Purnell and all sorts of science fiction stuff like that.
Well, you mentioned Ultima VI, which is actually just one of my absolute all-time favorite games. And I heard you say that you and Richard were like in a room late at night kind of hammering out the story for that game. I was wondering if there was anything more you could say about that.
Well, it wasn't just a night, it was weeks. I went over to his house, and we spent weeks working on that, defining every quest, every character, what every character's motivation was, every significant object in the game. Designing out specific puzzles and multiple solutions to every puzzle. And, so I was there, from the beginning of the design effort, and learned Richard's way of designing, which involved filling out massive notebooks, full of every detail that the team was going to need to implement the game. And I actually haven't worked like that, but, seeing the master at work was, pretty eye-opening.
Was the idea about the gargoyles, was that there at the beginning, or is that something that you guys developed?
No, that was, well, I was there at the beginning. So it was something that was there at the beginning. And, Richard in Ultima VI really wanted to show that there wasn't just one moral code like he'd established in Ultima 4 and pursued in Ultima 5, the virtues. And what he wanted to look at was that those virtues were not absolute, that there could be different value sets. But that was just the kind of thing that got me excited about what Richard was doing. He wasn't just making, what we called Monty Hall dungeons, where you would, break down a door, fight the monster in the room, grab the treasure, and then break down the next door and fight the next monster and grab the next treasure. He was really, telling stories that were about something. And in that way, he was very much like Bruce, and I hope very much like I've been able to accomplish in the games I've made since. One of the things I always do is, think through what is this game really about? What's the subtext? What's the theme we're exploring? How do we let players interact with these themes and answer the questions that we're asking? And Richard was all over that, long time ago.
Well, I mean, just one of my absolute favorite game design stories, too, is from Ultima VI. It's the Sherry the Mouse story. Could you tell that story?
Oh, yeah. Well, we tried to come up with pre-scripted ways of solving puzzles, and usually more than one. But there was one puzzle in the game where there was only one solution. And basically it was a lever on one side of a portcullis. And the player came up on the other side of the portcullis, on the opposite side, away from the lever. And you had to flip the lever to raise the portcullis to continue making progress. And the only way, here are the air quotes around only, the only way to flip the lever was to use the telekinesis spell. And I saw one of our testers, it was a guy named Mark Shafkin, actually, who I've worked with again over the years. But Mark was there, didn't have the telekinesis spell, and I was sort of rubbing my hands with glee thinking, oh, this guy is screwed. He's not going to be able to make progress. And what I didn't realize was that there was just enough of a simulation on that portcullis. It didn't quite come down to the floor. There was a little gap there. And he had a character in his party named Sherry the Mouse, who was, surprise, surprise, a mouse. And she was small enough to fit under the portcullis and get to the lever and then flip the lever, raising the portcullis. And that was a revelatory moment for me, because he had found a solution to that puzzle that the developers of the puzzle didn't know existed, and which I suspect no one in the world had ever tried before. And it was a total accident. But that was the moment where I said, I'm going to do that for a living for the rest of my career, and do it on purpose. Because it's so powerful. I mean, when a player discovers a new solution to a problem and gets to show how clever and creative they are, that's what games can do that no other medium can do. And that was the first time I had ever seen that happen.
Right. So are there other good examples of that you can think of where you were able later to do it on purpose?
Well, gosh, I mean, look at every game I've worked on since, Deus Ex is probably the classic example. There were all sorts of times when players discovered things that the team didn't know would work. I was watching one of our testers demonstrate the game for some publisher side executives, and this was a year after we shipped the game, by the way. And he was in the Statue of Liberty, in the main area of the Statue of Liberty, and there was a spot where there were laser triggers in front of a doorway, and guards walking behind it on a timed path. And I had been in that place 100 times myself testing, and I'd seen probably 1,000 people go through it. And he figured out a way to solve that problem. Both the guards and the laser trigger problem with one shot from a pistol, which was the weakest weapon in the game, just by moving around explosive barrels and putting them in the right place and everything. It was amazing, because a year after we shipped, this guy showed me something that, again, probably no one in the world had ever tried before. And I was watching him set it up and knew what he was trying to do. But all I could think, as one of the guys who worked on the game, was, is that going to work? Is that going to? And sure enough, it worked. So, the whole point of Deus Ex was to create situations where players can find their own solutions to problems. And I think it worked pretty well. At Disney Epic Mickey, same thing, though. Core gamers, I don't think gave it much of a shot, but if you look at Disney Epic Mickey, it's the same core philosophy. It's really about designers getting off the stage and letting players get on it. And designers, instead of showing off how clever and creative they are at creating puzzles, letting players show how clever and creative they are at solving problems. That's what games are all about for me.
Yeah. Okay, well, so tell us about Ultima Underworld. How did you get involved with that?
It was a CES show before there was an E3. Games were shown at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and Paul Neurath, who had just started a company called Blue Sky Productions, and with whom I had worked on Space Rogue, a game he did earlier. He came to the booth to show off a demo of the very first in the history of humankind fully textured first-person 3D real-time game. And it was just a tech demo. And it was funny because some of the other people from Origin, looked at it, and I think they didn't want to show how impressed they were. I don't know what was going on, but they looked at it and they sort of shrugged their shoulders and went, yeah, okay. And I looked at it and thought, holy cow, the world just changed. And so I went to my boss, Dallas Snell, who was the VP of Product Development at Origin at the time, and said, you've got to let me work on this. You've got to let me work on this game. And he didn't. He gave it to someone else, which really ticked me off. But after a while, that guy left. And I said, Dallas, give me that game. It was still very early in development, before the narrative was in place, before the team was in place. And so I got to work on that with the insanely talented Blue Sky Productions team that was, led by Paul and then later by Doug Church, who's one of the secret masters of gaming, probably the best designer, best programmer, smartest guy I've ever met. I mean, I still talk to him all the time. We're still friends. We've worked together on many projects, but that team was amazing. I'll never forget the first time I actually met with the team, and I think they were having a conversation in Old English or something. But I walked into that room and realized that I was the dumbest person in the room, and that was awesome. When you have a team like that, something great is going to happen.
Well, right. The thing about Ultima Underworld is that, like you were saying, in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons games, you would just walk into a featureless brick room and there would be 58 orcs in there. And you're like, what are these 58 orcs doing in this room? It makes no sense. But Underworld really felt like a real place. You could imagine, how these monsters ate and where they lived. And the whole thing just seemed to make sense in a way I'd never seen before in a dungeon game.
Well, that was certainly the plan. It was about creating a believable ecosystem, a believable world. One of the interesting and fun things is Origin's motto was, we create worlds. And Paul, having come from that background, having worked with Origin, I think took that with him. And on Underworld, the team really embraced it and created a world that made sense. Again, I still talk to Doug all the time. I was talking to him the other day, and what he said something that was really brilliant. He said, what we were doing back then was creating open world games in corridors. They're that fully fleshed out and that open to player expression, despite the fact that they're set underground or, in the case of System Shock, for example, in the corridors of a space station. So the fact that people got it was really gratifying.
Yeah, and Ultima Underworld, it was really interesting too, because it was hard at the beginning. You have to get food and you have to find torches, or you can't see anything, and you really feel like you've been thrown into this dungeon with nothing, and you have to figure out how to survive.
Yeah. What would happen if you were really imprisoned in a dungeon? That's creating a believable world means doing that sort of thing. But don't forget about the giant rats. I mean, you also have to defeat some giant rats. It was about making you believe that you were there. That was actually one of the things I learned from Richard, and I think we expressed even better in the first-person games like Underworld and System Shock and Thief and Deus Ex. It's not about you controlling a puppet. Most third-person games in particular, but many games are about you controlling a puppet that has a personality, that's imposed on you, that has abilities that are imposed on you. We wanted it to feel like you, the human, in this alternate world. And that's something that all of us who come out of the Origin and Looking Glass tradition have strived to do ever since. That's a really powerful thing when what you're doing in a game says more about you as a person than it does about the character you're playing. That's another thing that games do that other media can't. It's really saying more about you and what you think is right and what you think is wrong and what you think is an appropriate way to deal with a character or a problem that's important. And the Ultima games, the traditional Ultima games, the numbered Ultima games, did some of that. But once we switched over to that first-person view, we really could make it about you. And that's one of the reasons why, the character in System Shock was just the hacker, and the character in Underworld was just the avatar, because we didn't want to impose even a name or a personality on the player character.
Right. So you mentioned in System Shock the protagonist is this hacker character, and obviously, would you say there was a lot of Bruce Sterling, William Gibson influence on that game?
Yeah, I don't know how much I can take credit for that. I mean, again, there was a Looking Glass team that really drove a lot of the creative. I mean, there were times when they drove me crazy. But at that point, cyberpunk fiction was what it was all about, and ideas of what the future could really be like. The world of, what is it, Zaibatsu, international corporations, and a world of where data is currency, and where, human augmentation is a reality. I mean, all that stuff was sort of in the ether. And everybody's, there on the team was a science fiction fan. So yeah, of course there was influence. The people ask me all the time, where do you get ideas? And everybody gets that question all the time. Who's, writers, filmmakers, and everything. And you get ideas from the cultural zeitgeist. What's in the air. And at that time, cyberpunk was what was in the air.
Back in episode 84, I interviewed Austin Grossman, who worked on Underworld 2 and System Shock. I was just wondering if you had any memories of working with him.
Austin, yeah, I still talk to him all the time, too. Austin is a brilliant writer. But even beyond his brilliance as a writer, he gets the idea of getting off the stage, that the player's story is more important than the story he wants to tell. So he knows how to engage players and let players craft unique experiences from the narrative tools that he provides. It's like in System Shock, everybody on the station is dead. I mean, that came out of discussions that Paul and Doug and I had where, we lamented the pathetic state of conversation systems in games, which, by the way, still exists today. There have been no advances in conversation systems since the late 80s. Somebody needs to work on that. But anyway, we didn't know how to do conversation, so we killed everybody off. And Austin really figured out how to tell a story through, video logs and audio logs and what's going on behind that door and using sound to tell stories. I mean, the whole team was involved in that. But Austin, despite being like I said, a brilliant writer, understood the power of letting players tell their own stories. And there were many times where, Doug and Austin and I would be sitting around late at night going over, narrative documents, story documents, and tweaking them and tuning them and seeing them come to life was pretty exciting.
Yeah. And so it seems like these two games, Ultima Underworld and System Shock, seem to have just had a massive influence on computer role-playing games. If you look at the Ultima Ascendant website, there are testimonials from it's like a who's who of CRPG designers saying these were the games that really made me want to do this.
Yeah, it's always nice to... There are a variety of measures of success, okay? Some people measure success in terms of sales. And some people measure success in terms of, fame, and others in terms of revenue. And none of us ever defined success that way. I mean, it's always nice to make a lot of money and get famous and everything. Don't get me wrong, but what at least I was thinking. I can't speak for Paul or Doug or anybody else on the team, but especially when we were working on Deus Ex, but even back in the Underworld and System Shock days, having an influence and changing things is a measure of success too. And I remember, sitting around with the guys at Blue Sky and then later Looking Glass, the same company with a different name. But I remember sitting around and just talking about, why isn't everybody making games like this? And for years, people may say that they were influenced, but I didn't really see the influence. It was only after Deus Ex that people started coming up to me and saying, I'm changing this isn't the reason I want to make games, but I'm changing the way I make games based on what this game. So I think Underworld, System Shock, Thief, Deus Ex, now Dishonored. I think we did have an influence. Games like Knights of the Old Republic and back in the day, No One Lives Forever, and Fable, and games like that. Would they have happened without games like Underworld and System Shock? I'm not sure. I like to think they wouldn't, but that might just be my ego running wild.
Well, like in BioShock in particular, this idea of exploring a utopia that's gone wrong seems to me drawn straight out of Ultima Underworld. Yeah,
I certainly the BioShock games grew out of that tradition. Ken Levine worked at Looking Glass for several years and was involved in the Thief projects, and then in System Shock 2. The BioShock games are more linear and more designer narrative driven than I think the traditional Looking Glass games that Underworld and System Shock were. But you can clearly see the influence. I call BioShock and games like Half-Life sort of kissing cousins of what we were all trying to do at Origin and Looking Glass and Ion Storm. But certainly there's influence there.
Yeah. And so when you look back at Ultima Underworld and System Shock now, are there things that you really wish you could go back and change?
I tend not to look back too much. They were the best we could do at the time with the knowledge and tools we had. One of the reasons I'm so excited about OtherSide and Underworld Ascendant and soon, I hope, System Shock 3 is that we've learned a lot in 20 years about what works and what doesn't. And we have a lot of tools on the tech side that we didn't have. So we've got new design knowledge and new tech tools. And so I think we can do an even better job of immersing players in a deeply simulated world than we could then. But no, I wouldn't go back and change anything. We worked hard. We did the best we could. I like to think we made a difference. You can't ask for much more than that.
Right. Well, yes. Why don't you tell us about these new games, Underworld Ascendant and System Shock 3? Kind of what's the current state of development on those?
Underworld Ascendant is far enough along that they've got a good, solid gameplay core, and they know what they're going after, and they've built a bunch of test levels that are really coming along nicely. They've built levels that are going to ship with the game in fairly typical Origin and Looking Glass fashion. They haven't finalized the graphical look yet because that's for many of us graphics come last, so they still have some work to do on that front. But the gameplay is really coming along. System Shock 3, very early, very, very, very early enough that I can't really say too much about it. I agreed to join OtherSide. What was it? The first day of DICE this year. So what is that? 3 weeks ago or something. So I'm working on concept documents and pitch documents and looking ahead and thinking about what the design is really going to be. But it's in the very, very earliest stages. We've just started doing concept art, and I think 2 pieces of concept art, something like that. So Shock 3 is very early.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously a lot of people work on these games, and you're listed as a producer mostly for the games that you've worked on. Could you just say a little bit about what exactly your role is going to be on, say, Underworld Ascendant and System Shock 3?
On Underworld Ascendant, I've been on OtherSide's board of advisors since the start, and so they send me design documents and they send me concept art and they send me videos and builds and stuff, and I give them feedback, and that will continue. Now that I'm working for the company, it'd be great if they let me play a larger role, but I think I'm just going to be an advisor on that one. On System Shock 3, I'm going to be the creative director, the game director, whatever you want to call it. I think of it as the guy with one more vote than everybody else on the team combined. But I'm working on the concept and right now determining what the game is going to be. I'm going to bring in a brain trust, a strong programmer, strong artist, strong systems and mechanics designer, maybe someone to handle operational details so I don't have to. But I'm conceptualizing the game and going to drive it to completion.
Well, because it seems like a big part of your role on these earlier games was to interface with the corporation and say, no, this is a really good game. Don't kill it. Don't kill it. Don't kill it.
Well, I certainly did enough of that. That's for sure. Nowadays, producers are typically just schedulers and people managers. But I was lucky enough to get into digital games at a point where it was still possible to be a creative producer. So I've always, I should say past tense, I used to. I don't handle schedules and budgets anymore. I can't stand that stuff. And luckily I've reached a point where I don't have to do it. But I used to handle a bunch of that stuff. But I was always involved in the creative. From Ultima VI on, I was able to merge the creative and the what would now be considered the production side of game development. So again, I just got lucky. Nowadays, I'm not sure that creative producer role exists, and it's a shame because it's a great role. I'll tell you. You asked me if I would go back and change anything on the games. I'll tell you, if I look back on my career, I wouldn't change anything either.
I mean, is it? It must be nice though, or is it having the Kickstarted games now that you don't have to be justifying anything to the larger company?
Well, I have real mixed feelings about Kickstarter. Actually, you never want to say never. I may do one at some point, but on a Kickstarter, you have pick a number. 10,000 people you have to satisfy instead of a publisher where you have a small group of decision makers that you have to satisfy. I think there are advantages both ways. I don't think Kickstarter is, idyllic or utopian. It carries with it its own pluses and minuses. Certainly for traditional indie developers, it's nice that there's another way to get funding other than going through publishers. I think what Kickstarter has done is it's broadened the creative range of games because smaller developers can find a way to actually fund their ideas. That's one of the more exciting things that's going on in games right now. Is if you have an idea, there's a way to fund it. There are tools to build it, and there are a bunch of ways to reach an audience with it. So we're seeing variety in games now that we haven't seen in decades. So it's a pretty exciting time for games.
I mean, what would you say are some of the challenges for a game like Underworld Ascendant competing in a market where there's games like BioShock Infinite that have, like 10 to, it would be probably like 100 times the budget, right? 50 to 100 times the budget?
Well, I don't know how many times, but certainly at OtherSide, we're trying to do things differently. I won't speak for the company or for Paul at this point, but speaking for myself, at Ion Storm, we had 100-person teams, and at Junction Point, we grew to 200 people. What am I talking about? we grew to 200 people. And on Epic Mickey 2, if you look at the credits, we had 800 people touch that game in one way or another. And I never want to do that again as long as I live. So the idea of being able to go back and work on a smaller team with a smaller budget and getting creative about it, being creative with how you develop your games, using not outsourcers, but partners, real collaborative partners. And here are the air quotes around this too, growing the team externally, I think is a really exciting idea. Working on the Epic Mickey games, we worked with, I think it was, 15 to 20 outside companies, some of which, actually built levels for us. And they weren't just outsourcers. They were genuine partners. And out of those 15 or 20, there are a handful that I can't wait to work with again. And so I'm planning on System Shock 3 having a small team with a bunch of external partners. And in that way, I think we can create we can create competitive games with smaller budgets and much smaller teams, which means instead of, I call it playing defense, instead of protecting the team from outside influences, let's just say, I can be more in the trenches again, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think is so interesting is that the two most successful video game Kickstarters, to my knowledge, are Chris Roberts' Star Citizen and Richard Garriott's Shroud of the Avatar.
Yeah.
Like, why do you think former Origin employees have been so successful with crowdfunding?
I have no idea. Maybe I should do one. Maybe there's some magic. I don't know. I think it has to be. Okay, has to be is too strong. If I were a betting man, I would say it comes down to a few things. One is Kickstarter is, in a sense, a great place for nostalgia. There's a built-in audience for Ultima games. There's a built-in audience for Wing Commander games. And no one is making games like that, or you could make that argument. So there's this existing fan base and pent-up desire that they can take advantage of. And look at some of the other successful Kickstarters beyond Chris and Rick. There are a lot of nostalgia plays on Kickstarter. So I think it's partly that. I think it's partly that there's a certain celebrity aspect to it. Richard Garriott and Chris Roberts, their names are well known. Their reputation for creating great games is well known. So that probably plays into it. And then, one of the most important lessons I learned from those guys when I first started working at Origin was the power of a clear, compelling vision. It's what are the things you're unwilling to compromise on? You have to be able to answer that question. I will not compromise on this. And Chris and Richard really understand that. If not consciously, then unconsciously. They always have a vision, and they are uncompromising in the realization of that vision. And I think that probably comes through in their Kickstarter campaigns and their follow-up, websites and donation opportunities and all that. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. But man, I think after this, I'm going to do it.
Well, you used the word magic, and I feel like I'm a complete rationalist, but I wonder if there is some magic involved, because it just seems like Origin, there was just something magical about it. Maybe it is the nostalgia, like you said, but it just seems like there was something magical about Origin that nothing has quite recaptured for me since then.
Well, it's kind of true. There was for me, I don't want to speak for everyone, but there was a feeling at Origin that was really special. Looking Glass had a lot of it too, and I hope people would tell you that Ion Storm Austin and Junction Point had it, but at Origin, there was this real sense. It was tangible. You could feel it, that we were going to change the world, and that is a pretty powerful thing to believe. And, looking back on it now, we kind of did. Not Origin specifically, but, digital games ended up changing the world. And I don't know if everybody making games back then or even today realized it or felt it or feels it, but there was some magic to being part of Origin. And one of my minor regrets is when I was working there, I think I was the 26th person hired by the company. And I really thought I was going to retire from Origin and get a gold watch and all of that. And that's just not the way this business works. And even if it did, there would have come a point where I just had to do a startup and do my own thing and all. But it was a very special place. There's no doubt. And the fact that it was a special place probably it helped us create special games.
Well, you mentioned Ion Storm. I have kind of a funny story about how I almost got a job as a writer at Ion Storm.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, so because my best friend from high school was working at Ion Storm Dallas, and so I was hanging out with a bunch of those guys, and I moved out there after college and was just trying to get a job as a writer in video games. And I realized in retrospect, pitching yourself as a writer was not the best approach to take. But I had a bunch of stories published, and so somebody showed them to somebody who was hiring for Deus Ex 2. Mm-hmm. And so months went by. I was just hanging out, and I kept emailing, and the guy said, "Oh, keep checking in. I'll set up an interview for you." And my parents were taking a trip to Europe, and they invited me to come with them. And it was a week-long trip, and I'd been waiting months and months. And I was like, "Oh, what are the odds I'm going to get called for an interview this 1 week, right?" So I left for Europe, and I'm in Europe, and that morning I checked my email, and the person says, "Oh, can you come in for an interview tomorrow?" Basically.
Oh, no.
And I said, "Oh, I really, really want to do this, but I'm in Europe. I'll be back in a week." And by the time I get back, they had already hired someone else.
Wow. Well, so we came this close to working together. That's crazy.
Well, if they would have hired, I don't know if they actually would have hired me, but...
okay, so we came this close, not this close.
You're holding your arms more farther apart, right?
There you go. I painted an audio picture for you.
But yeah, no, that would have been really cool, though. But I mean, one thing that really struck me, though, is, hanging around the video game people at that time was, I would say I want to be a writer for video games. And a lot of people would say, like, what does a video game need a writer for? There was a lot of that attitude. And I saw you say that you went into one product meeting and you were told, "Warren, you're not allowed to say the word story ever again."
Yeah, that was a magic moment for me, I'll tell you. At Origin, we never felt that way. At Looking Glass, we never felt that way. Though, again, we wanted players to tell their own stories. I mean, the ideal is that every player at the end of the game looks back on a unique experience. That's the grail. But we were all into narrative games. And I've never compromised on that. I never let anybody talk me out of it. But there was one executive who I will not name at one company that I will not name that I worked for, who said that in a meeting. And that was kind of a point where I knew my days were numbered at that company. No, things have certainly changed. I think at this point, no one doubts the importance of narrative. And I think, writers can play a part in that. The interesting challenge for me is finding writers, who have the technical chops, who are programmer enough to understand the difference between game writing and screenwriting or novel writing, and B, are willing to help craft narratives that belong to the player and not to them. So for me, finding writers is a real challenge, and I've been incredibly lucky. Again, getting to work with Austin Grossman was great. And a little later on, I found Sheldon Picotti, who was the lead writer on Deus Ex and Invisible War. Finding guys like that who get the whole immersive simulation idea is not easy. And I've been very lucky to have found a couple of those. And I'll be looking for more come System Shock 3 time. So if you're out there, maybe send me a resume and some samples.
Okay, awesome. One thing I saw you talking about that I thought was really interesting is you said at one point you want to do what you called a one-block role-playing game, where the whole game takes place on one city block.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that for decades. And the thing, here's the thing. There are, if you look at a lot of the games that sort of claim to be about player choice and consequences and all that, which is kind of what I do for a living. If you look at them, a lot of them are open world games, and I kind of feel like most of those games are simulated an inch deep and miles wide. And what I try to do in my games, and what we did at Origin and Looking Glass in those games, was try to simulate an inch wide and miles deep. And I just find that idea more compelling, because there's more room for player expression in a deeper simulation. And so, boiling that down, I used to talk to Doug Church about this, and he wants to do a one-room role-playing game, which I think is a little too minimal. Okay, but I kind of know the setting for a one-block role-playing game that I would explore, and I have some ideas about how I would do it. But the reality is, if I knew how to do it, I would do it. And I don't have it figured out enough in my mind to have the guts to go and ask anybody to fund it. So someday maybe I'll figure it out. And to be frank, as I start thinking about System Shock 3, Shodan's going to play a role, and Citadel Station's going to play a role, and maybe Citadel is going to be the one block. Who knows? So we'll see how that goes.
I mean, it seems like the real challenge for games is to make games that don't involve hitting things, or that aren't primarily concerned with hitting things, and that's so hard to do on a computer.
It's hard, but not impossible. The reality is it's very easy for us to simulate the pulling of a virtual trigger, and it's very, very hard for us to simulate a conversation. I was saying this earlier. I defy anybody to show me a conversation system in a game today that isn't identical to the conversation systems that Richard Garriott was using in the 80s. It's just, the big innovation in conversation systems now is that there's a timer on your choice on the branching tree. And I just don't think that's good enough. But again, if I knew how to solve that problem, I would. I'm not disparaging everybody in the game business. What I am saying is I wish we would spend a little bit less time on combat AI and a little bit more on non-combat AI, on creating characters you can bond with on an emotional level, without putting those characters in the context of a completely linear storyline. If you put players on rails, which a lot of the narrative games do now, of course you can tell a great story. I mean, it's a linear narrative. It belongs to the writer or the designer and not to the player. But what I think we need to be working on is more compelling characters that are simulated as deeply as we can now simulate a physical world. And, once we start focusing more on characters, I think you'll see both more player-driven stories and also less of a focus on combat. But right now, we either do combat in a player-driven space really well, or emotion and character in a completely linear space, and no one knows, or no one's talking about, and no one's making games that reveal how you combine those two and create a player-driven environment with real emotionally compelling characters. And I would like to think we're going to tackle that in System Shock 3, because somebody has to fail a million times before we succeed. But it's still early days, so we'll see. But that's certainly on my list of things that I'm thinking about for System Shock 3.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen this video. Someone just told me about it, but apparently someone plays through Deus Ex, and there's a flagpole you can pick up near the beginning of the game, and every time they talk to a character, they just put it down next to the person.
Oh, that's great. I love hearing that. That was the best we could do at the time. The fact is, in Deus Ex, the world was pretty responsive, and the characters we're paying attention. That you want a world that notices what players are doing and responds appropriately. And it's like you asked about Underworld and System Shock before. Would I change anything? No. And on Deus Ex, we did the best we could at the time, So there were plenty of ways to break Deus Ex. And, a lot of people on the team got upset about the ways in which players broke the game. But I kept on saying, once they buy it, it's their game. If they're having fun, more power to them. It's their game. That was the whole point of the game. You play the way you want to. I actually have a mission statement that I've carried with me for the last 15 years from one studio to another. That's all about player empowerment and players telling their own story and sharing authorship with players. And I've got a 12-page version of it that no one would read, and an 8-page version that no one would read, and a 4-page version that no one would read, and a 2-page version, and a 1-page, and a paragraph. And finally, I got sick and tired of it, so I boiled it down to 2 words. Playstyle matters. How the player decides to interact with your game and your game world is the only thing that matters. And the world should notice and respond appropriately. And all we can do is do a little bit better with each game at making playstyle matter.
Right. Yeah. I don't mention that as a criticism. It's just an example. Like, how could you possibly foresee something like that? And how could you possibly program a game that would take every kind of random thing like that into account?
Well, we'll find out someday. It's a great goal to have a game that responds to flagpoles. But and maybe someday we'll get there. I don't know. A lot of people think it's going to take, a lot more AI research than we've done so far. But in a sense, games are a business of smoke and mirrors. We don't have to pass the Turing test. We just have to create a convincing, believable character. We don't have to create the ultimate AI. That's probably better left to academics than to game developers. But I have confidence that someday we'll get there. Someone's going to nail it and figure out how to do not perfect characters, but emotionally compelling characters that can contribute to a player's story instead of a writer's story.
Yeah. Okay, so there's just one other thing I want to run by you. So I've been following Richard Garriott's Shroud of the Avatar crowdfunding stuff really obsessively because I just find it so fascinating. It seems to me such a amazingly effective example of creating a community and having the community support your efforts. But the thing that's really struck me is it seems like for all the time that I've been playing games, it's been kind of an arms race of features. The graphics are better, or the controls are better, or whatever. And it seems to me that all that stuff is kind of flattening out, and that we're moving into an era where the community around the game is going to be the main selling point of the game, not really the game itself. Like, do you like the people who play this game? Do you like talking to them and having them help you out and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see where you would get that idea, and I can see the appeal of it. I'm never going to work again in my life. But, I've always just made or worked on the games that I wanted to make or work on, and hope there are enough people out there in the world who like them that I get to make another one. I understand the need to involve the community, but I've never done it. So I think on System Shock 3, I'm going to find out if I like it or not, because you're correct, certainly, in saying that it's a necessary part of the business. But other than the sort of after-the-fact community that built up around Deus Ex and Disney Epic Mickey, the post-ship community, I've never actually been a part of something like that. Well, I guess, like the Ultimate Dragons, were continue to be a community built up around the Ultimate games, and the TTLG, the Through the Looking Glass folks are an immersive simulation community, but that was all after the fact. It'll be interesting to see how I deal with involving the community during the creation of the game. That'll be something new to me. But frankly, that's one of the reasons why I'm leaving the University of Texas at this moment, because even in the 3 years I've been here, running the Digny Sam's Gaming Academy, the game business and the medium have changed so much that I feel like I'm falling behind. And so I have a lot to learn, and love the fact that I have a lot to learn. So this is a good time for me to be getting back into development. So get back to me on that whole community thing so a little bit later on, and we'll see if I have a different or better answer for you.
Okay, so unfortunately we're out of time. So just to wrap things up, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about the academic program you just mentioned? Just anything else you want to let people know about?
Well, the DSGA was formed 3 years ago. We run 2 classes through the program, and it's about training creative and production leadership for the game business. I think we do a very bad job of that, of helping people make that transition from being individual contributors to being leaders. And so, the university supported me in creating a program designed to teach leadership skills, communication, conflict resolution, some project management, creative vision making, creative vision maintaining, all that stuff. And so it was, I needed a change of pace when Junction Point shut down, and this was a good one. I needed some new challenges, and being a part of an academic program was certainly a new set of challenges. But now, like I said, there's a lot to learn about the business I've been in for 33 years. And so I'm looking forward to those new challenges now.
All right, so we've been speaking with Warren Spector about these upcoming games Underworld, Ascendant, and System Shock 3. So Warren, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. It was great.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Warren Spector for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Shazmaster1984 in the UK, who writes, Ultimate Geek Podcast. This is easily the best podcast on iTunes. The host is intelligent, articulate, has awesome guests, and always points me in the direction of new, interesting material to geek out on. Fan for life. So big thanks again to Shazmaster1984 for that great review. Special thanks as well to Molly Benson and Colin Cheney, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.